Hey, welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays. And it's my first video episode because we are normally an audio only podcast. So there's going to be a learning curve, and I'm on the up and up. Today's episode, we're talking about consciousness, myth, and the power of belief with returning guest, Dr. David Skrbina. And we're talking about metaphysical claims because most mythicists and scholars that are debating, was Jesus real, like a historical figure, was he a literary construct? They operate from a philosophical framework that's called materialism. And so what this claim states is that matter is fundamental and consciousness is something that comes from matter in the brain when it's arranged in a certain way. And so mind comes after matter, meaning comes after biology, and religion just becomes a byproduct of social evolution. But there's a philosophical tension that's hiding inside this assumption, y'all. And this is what we're going to talk about today, because evolution will explain how biological bodies change, how organisms adapt and diversify, but it doesn't explain something that's actually more basic. Why is there subjective experience at all? Why does pain actually hurt? Why does the color red look like something? So if matter is completely mindless at the ground level, then how does experience suddenly appear? And this is what philosophers call the emergence problem. So an alternative view, panpsychism, proposes that consciousness isn't produced by matter at all. Instead, consciousness may be fundamental to reality itself. In his book, Panpsychism in the West, Dr. Skrbina, he traces this idea across centuries of philosophical thought, showing that the notion of mind-infused cosmos has appeared again and again throughout Western intellectual history. And as you guys know, Skrbina is also steeped directly in this Jesus mythicist debate with his book, The Jesus Hoax, which we have discussed previously on the podcast. And more recently, he published a sharp response to criticisms from fellow Jesus skeptics David Fitzgerald and Richard Carrier. And to that, Adam Green's recent book, The Jesus Deception, that is approaching early Christianity and the Jesus mythicist debate differently than Skrbina, but I believe is adding a lot to the conversation, and so does Skrbina. So we talk about that. So this conversation is going to move across several layers all at once. Consciousness, materialism, the emergence problem. I do touch a little bit on, is Paul a historical, strategist, or was he a literary invention? Because there's a new emerging kind of scholarly thought that Paul is literally not real as well. And so we also end the conversation talking about modern day apocalyptic Second Temple Judaism beliefs coming through evangelicalism, Christian nationalism with this war in Iran. And so Dr. Skrbina will give his take on that. So let us start with the philosophical ground beneath it all. I think that when we talk about the Jesus mythicism debates, this bigger layer that we could step into is the metaphysics aspect. And so many folks like Carrier and Fitzgerald and probably others are coming from this materialist kind of worldview concept. And my listeners are kind of familiar with that. And that's why I wanted to talk today with you before we kick off into all the Jesus myth and apocalyptic stuff. Panpsychism. Am I saying that right? Panpsychism?
Panpsychism or pantheism.
Okay.
Right?
So can you just, so anyone who's new to this, what is that in plain terms?
We can talk about panpsychism first, I guess, right? So conceptually it's a pretty straightforward concept, right? So it means that everything, that's what pan means in Greek, means everything has a psyche. So what's a psyche? You could call it a soul. That's a little bit of an old-fashioned term. The Greeks just used the word psyche. Today we think about it as mind or consciousness. So that's probably a better way to think about it. And it's the idea that like literally everything has some kind of mind, conscious awareness, some kind of mental attributes that we recognize in ourselves. Maybe obviously would be much simpler and more basic and more fundamental, but that somehow that everything sort of has those qualities to some degree. And it's actually it sounds a little bit crazy at first when you just first come across it, but it's actually a very ancient idea. It's sort of the original idea, I think, among human beings in terms of their metaphysics, if you will. If you go way back to ancient times, when in primitive societies, people were basically what we would today would call animists, right? So they saw some like spirits or gods in everything, in the sky and in the lightning and the thunder and the earthquakes and in the lions and the tigers and whatever else. Everything sort of was kind of a spirit or a god, and they might pray to them or sacrifice to them or whatever. But that made sense to them, that somehow to put some sort of personal attribute behind these mysterious powers in the universe and in nature around them. They didn't really understand them. Which is kind of funny, because now we would say, well, on one hand, that's completely wrong, but actually philosophically, we would say that's actually completely right. They had the basic idea was correct. They didn't really understand how things worked. Okay, we have different explanations, but that doesn't mean that the essential characteristics that they had, that there was some kind of psychic quality to these things in nature, including animals and plants and inanimate things. That's still actually a very well-grounded philosophical idea. It was very prominent in ancient Greece. It was prominent throughout most of history. It went away for most of the 20th century because we switched to scientific materialism, and then nobody wanted to talk about that. And at the end of the 20th century, it sort of came back because they couldn't make sense of mind or consciousness. And now panpsychism is at least in certain circles, is a respected and thriving view of mind. And I think it's the most promising, and I think it will probably win out in the end. Eventually, it may take some time, but I think that once again, it'll be accepted as basically the default view of reality in that sense.
Yeah, it definitely seems like materialism is very similar to like just trust the science kind of dogmatism that has come out of this scientism worldview. And what it talks about is that there's like nothing more than just matter, right? Can you explain for the listeners like what is?
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. Sometimes it's called materialism, sometimes it's called physicalism, but it's really basically the same idea that all that exists is material stuff. So matter, energy, atoms, atomic particles, whatever you want, right? But basically physical matter, the way that physics describes things, right? Mass particles, energy, photons, the traditional concepts of physics. And that's if you think that that's all that exists, and if you ask a physicist, they basically say, yeah, that's all that exists. Everything is mass and energy, or maybe even just energy, because mass is a kind of form of energy. So sometimes they go back and forth. Sometimes it's two things. Sometimes it's all one thing. It's all just energy. It's all just fields. Einstein has some nice quotes about everything is just a field. Okay, well, fine. But that's still a materialistic, physicalist view. And there are arguments to defend that, I should say, because people can explain a lot through science and materialistic physics. You can explain a lot. You can do a lot. You can build things. You can make atom bombs. You can make rocket ships. I mean, you can do a lot. But there's a lot of things you cannot explain also. And one of those is maybe the most important thing to explain, which is mind or consciousness. And science has a really hard time. In fact, it's like floundering. It's like a kindergartner, trying to do calculus. It just cannot really do anything when it comes to mind and consciousness. So that suggests there's a big gaping hole in our story. The physicalist stuff does good for physical things, but there's a whole other component of reality that would be the mind or consciousness or the psyche. And physics has like zero to say, just nothing. It just draws a blank. You're like, I don't know. Even to the point where some of them will say it doesn't even exist. They'll actually go so far as to say, since we cannot explain it, it must be a figment of your imagination. You actually don't have a soul. You don't have a psyche. You don't have a mind. You aren't really even conscious. You just think you're conscious. If you do, you're fooling yourself, because those things aren't real. I mean, it's really sort of extremely ludicrous what logic will drive them to if you really push a hardcore materialist, because they just have no answer to these things. It's really kind of funny in some ways to press these guys on those views.
Well said. I agree. And so it gets to the point where they'll deny it completely. And so Rupert Sheldrake, who we talk a lot about on this podcast, talks about the scientific creed. And yeah, it's like 10 dogmas, the 10 commandments of science, he calls it. All matter is unconscious. There's no inner life or subjectivity or point of view. Even human consciousness is an illusion produced by the material activities of the brain. And that's number 2 of the dogmas of science. And so that pinpoints it there. So that doesn't tell us why pain hurts or why when we see something that's red, like it doesn't tell us about that subjective experience. And I think this matters because when we're talking about where religion came from, we can talk about the new atheists like Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett, and where they come from and why these memes, these religious memes. So I do think this matters when it comes to this conversation we're having about religion, geopolitics, mythicism. Do you see what I'm trying to, why I think?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so that brings, there's a lot of good points in what you just said. And in one sense, the religion can be separate from this, right? So even though panpsychism sounds kind of new agey or religious, it's not really, technically, it's not really even a religious topic. It's completely separate. We're just talking about mind and consciousness and where it comes from and where it exists in the universe. So that's, in a sense, it's independent from God and religion and all those kind of things, right? It could be part of a religion. Some religions are panpsychist religions. So there's like there's sort of pagan religions are like that. The Shintos in Japan are like that. So some religions do have a panpsychist component, but that's those are really kind of logically separate topics, right? But evolution is sort of really a really important point, right? Because the scientists, they all believe in evolution. So it's good to throw it back in their face and say, okay, Mr. Scientist, Mr. Physicist, yeah, when in history did consciousness first show up? Because you're telling me it was not there in, let's say, the early boiling earth when it was just, volcanoes and whatever, or early oceans, there was no blip of life. You're telling me that back then, 4 billion years ago, there was zero consciousness and sentience. And today there's lots of it. There's lots of it in people, certainly some animals. Everybody would accept some animals are like this. So obviously 4 billion years ago, there was zero. Today there's lots of it. So when in that long history of 4 billion years did it go from zero to something, right? And then they get all flustered and they don't know what to say. And they're like, well, but it's just a complicated story or what, then they start doing a little tap dance and they start juggling their balls and they'll throw out fancy terms. But it's like, but wait a minute, it was zero 4 billion years ago. And today it's a whole bunch of conscious things. You can't go from zero. I can understand how you can go from something simple to something complicated because that sort of makes sense. Complexity can grow over time, but it's really hard to go from zero to something. That's like magic, right? Like just like poof, out of nowhere, it's like a Genesis story of humans. Well, there was no humans, and then God went poof, and then now there's humans. Okay, well, that's a kind of a story. It's a stupid story, but it's a kind of a story. You'd almost be reduced to that if you talk to the physicist. Well, maybe God just decided, bing, now there's consciousness. Well, okay, I guess if you want to be a religious physicist or something, it's like a little bit crazy, right? But they really have no good story about how this mind or consciousness emerges from zero mind and consciousness, from utterly none. So the panpsychist has a much better story because it says, well, look, it was always there at some very low level. Even before there were living things, there was still a kind of a low level consciousness, right down to the atoms, if you will. And then it just grew in complexity over time. And that's a relatively comprehensible and coherent story. We can sort of map that out in some way. But the hardcore materialists, they got nothing. They're just done. They're dead in the water. They cannot explain how you go from zero to complex consciousness. So it's a really interesting point to press on them who believe in evolution under their own view to explain how this happens. And it really shows that big hole, like I said, that big gaping hole in science. Then it comes out very clear when you press those points, and they just have no explanation for that.
Right. And so this is the emergence problem, is what we were just articulating, which is what you mentioned in the very beginning when you're laying out the work of how these ideas have been across centuries through Western thought. And here they are resurfacing because there is a gaping hole. There's a problem here. And so I often hear in this sphere of like the JQ spaces or the ex-religious spaces, people lean into Neoplatonianism. How do you say that?
Yeah, Neoplatonic or Neoplatonism. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'd like for you to, because people really seem to hold this in high regard, and not that I don't. I'm so new to all of this. I don't have much of an opinion. That's why I bring on the expert like you. So I think people might mix these two concepts up too. So would you mind kind of teasing them out? Because are they aligned? Are they
Yeah.
doing different things? Like what's going on with that?
Yeah, so Neoplatonism is kind of an interesting little divergent school of thought. I'm not actually much of an expert on it, so I can't really give you a lot of expertise, but generally it's understood to be sort of the merging of Platonic philosophy with sort of Christian theology in some sense, or religious theology, sort of turning Platonism into kind of a religion or a religious or a spiritual outlook, maybe is a better way to talk about it. So it starts sucking in sort of quasi-Christian ideas, and it gets blended with Platonic ideas, and that's generally the story about what this Platonist view is. So it's a little bit murky in that sense, and they start talking in like sort of funny mystical terms, and I'm sort of, as we will find out in a few minutes, highly skeptical of everything on the Christian side. So if you take something that's highly dubious and you mix it with something that's very solid, like Platonic thinking, you're going to get a weird mixture of sort of half good stuff, and half goofball theology from Christianity. So it's kind of like that. It's like a weird goofball mixture of solid ideas with goofy, Christian ideas. But it does sort of relate to panpsychism, because Plato was actually a panpsychist.
Right.
And this is sort of one of the things that I pressed in my book. So yeah, the book is Panpsychism in the West. So if you had that, I mentioned that one. If people are interested, want to read the whole story,
I'll pull it up.
Panpsychism in the West lays out that whole story going back to the pre-Socratic philosophers. But basically, Plato seems to, it's a little bit, you have to sort of read between the lines and look at what he's saying. But Plato basically seems to be a panpsychist. We know for sure that the pre-Socratic philosophers, the ones before Plato and Socrates, were almost to a man panpsychist, because they all said things in those little snippets of their fragments that we have that shows that they were thinking that there is a universal spiritual quality. Yes, there's my latest book, second edition of the book. Thanks. So all the philosophers leading up to Socrates and Plato were basically panpsychists. So you would naturally expect that Socrates would come along and Plato would come along, and they understand and respected their near forebears, those guys just lived in their immediate past. They knew some of them. They knew several of those individuals. And you would expect that they would respect those views and probably believe those views and argue further in defense of them. And that indeed seems to be what Plato has done in his work. So Plato is very generous in terms of who he's giving this idea of psyche to. So it's humans, it's animals, it's plants, it's the universe as a whole. It's the bones, the parts of the body have their own psyche. I mean, he just goes through a whole list of things that you're saying, well, there's actually no way to have this big long list of things that have a psyche without really sort of everything having a psyche. Because you can't just list up this part, here's a list of 12 things, and everything else does it. I mean, that wouldn't even make sense. So even though Plato's not quite explicit, you can read from what he's saying and from his logically conclude from his statements that he was basically, yes, he's falling in line with a panpsychist view, and really everything had this kind of psychic quality. So that's already built into Plato. And then that through time, the Neoplatonists, this is after, so Plato's 350 BC. And then so we're talking, well into the Christian era, so 280 or 380, I don't even know the official start of Neoplatonic thinking. So it's like 600 years later. And then, like I say, then these Christian ideas start creeping in, and they start mixing it with Platonic ideas, including Platonic panpsychism. And so you get sort of, again, this little weird mixture of Plato's thinking on things and maybe universal consciousness, and then maybe, consciousness and things up throughout nature. It seems to be there when you read sort of some of the Neoplatonist thinkers. But yeah, I don't know. Like I say, it was all, for me, it was all a little bit too murky and too mystical and too mysterious and a little bit too esoteric, and reading between the lines and all this kind of stuff. So So I never really dug into it too much. I didn't put a lot of weight in it, but what I have seen, it does seem to be consistent with Platonic panpsychism. So again, they are also, which is kind of interesting because Christianity does not accept that. That's one of the hallmarks of Christianity, is what it does is it sucks all of that psyche out of the world that was there beforehand. It was in animals and plants and things in nature and rocks and inanimate things. And Christianity said, no, I'm going to suck all that out. It's like a giant vacuum cleaner. I'm going to suck all the psyche out. And the only things that have souls are people and God and the angels and whatever. So there's divine, magical beings, and nobody else does. I mean, it was really a radical move by the Christians to obliterate psyche in everything else. Animals, plants, all of nature just evaporate. It's just people. It's very, anthropocentric in the sense that it really focuses on people are different, better than everything else. There are actually good reasons for this. It comes from Judeo-Christian thinking, specifically in the Old Testament. So we actually know exactly why that happened.
Yeah, we do.
So it's not a mistake. It's not an accident. We know exactly why that happened, but in fact, it did happen. And then that's been sort of one of the curses of Christianity ever since, is that it had sucked all the soul out of nature. So everything is just more or less, either inanimate stuff or just biological robots that don't count for anything.
Yep.
So animals don't count for anything. Plants don't count for anything. We just slaughter things. We just use them, because we have souls and they don't. And we look like God and they don't. All this kind of, nonsense that we hear from the Christian thinking. So Christianity's been a disaster for multiple reasons. That's just one more reason why it's been a disaster. But it did have this weird mixing with Platonic thinking, which was panpsychist. So then you get this sort of goofy, like I said, this weird mixture. You took a non-panpsychist theology and you mix it with a panpsychist Platonic thinking, and okay, it's kind of a goofy goofball mixture. So yeah, that's kind of the short story of all that.
Yeah, I can relate to what you're saying. And I guess that's the difficult aspect of when we kind of step out of the materialist, and like if we can't test it, it's not real. And that we will get into some of this mysterious, esoteric kind of concepts. And so it is definitely difficult. And so I'm wondering, from the one side, I think one of my listeners or subscribers on Substack who is purporting this concept of Platonism is this the need for having some sort of metaphysical framework. You kind of touched on that, but the difficulty is to pull from something that isn't influenced by Abrahamic worldview in some way, shape, or form. And that's what you're saying. And so in regards to me as a pagan, whether we're Reconstructionists or a neo-pagan, it's just really difficult in where we are in today's day and age to exist, to not have it influence us, especially in America or in Europe. It's just, I think it's a true tragedy. I agree with you there. And so, and in regards to, and I wanted to touch on, oh my gosh, I was a Christian for a very short time. We've talked about that. I was recruited into it during the scamdemic and then left it in 2.5 years. But gosh, yeah. So in Genesis, God breathes into Adam and gives him his soul. And so I did this whole deep dive into how animals don't have souls. And I am a huge animal lover. I have lots of pets. We have homestead here. I was traumatized by that. And first, as a little girl, I cried asking Jesus to come into the hearts of my pets. And I was like, they don't know they've done wrong. I remember just thinking, this is why it's spiritual abuse to teach your kids this stuff. I was just crying, worried about my pets going to hell as a 5 and 6-year-old girl. And then as a 37-year-old woman still being like, what? They don't have souls? Like, just such a deranged worldview once you really can look at it critically for so many reasons. But I really appreciate that we touched on that, because I think that does give way to, Christopher John Birkins. People have mixed opinions on him. Are you aware of his work at all? CJ?
A little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got mixed opinions on him in the spaces for sure. But his concept of like they have a war on beauty and they want to destroy everything beautiful is a big thing that he purports. And I think that's true in regards to even this beautiful world and the animals and some of that. I feel like, yeah, like they poison the water, they poison the food. Like, as my little lowercase c conspiracy theorist brain, I was like, oh my gosh, put on your tinfoil bikini and let's start. So before we move into the main segment here, one of my subscribers wanted to ask you a little bit more. Are you familiar with the Penrose and Hameroff kind of experiments about these quantum processes at all? or the OR theory at all?
Or yeah.
Can you touch on
Right.
that a little bit
Yeah.
before we move on for one of my
Yeah.
pals?
I've known about that for a long time.
Cool. I do
I've
not.
yeah, no, I know Stuart. I've met him a couple times, and
Cool.
we've been in contact over the years. So yeah, it's a kind of panpsychist theory that they're looking at structures in the brain, right, and the way the neurons are structured, and there's some particular neural structure that's a kind of a tube, right, a neural tube that's like super. I don't know that. I'm not going to give you the detailed version. Microtubules, very small, like sort of nanoscale tube structures in your brain, and they have the right physical dimensions to sort of I don't know, to be the site of quantum collapse. I guess it has to happen on a very small scale.
Yeah, I have some of it here on the screen for us. Some of their
yeah
methods. Yeah, just for some.
right, so they're saying you need to have these really micro nanoscale structures, physical structures, and then you can see weird sort of physical quantum effects, because it happens at very extreme small dimensions. And they're speculating that these little collapse moments that occur, I mean, whatever, about 100 milliseconds, I guess it is kind of a periodic collapse, like a bing, 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 bing. And what they're kind of saying is they're correlating this with conscious moments. And with sort of little blips, little flashes of consciousness, if you will. And this idea sort of goes back to, I think Whitehead talked about it, even William James talked about this idea like drops of consciousness, like it's just little blips, like little blinking lights, and because it blink, 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 it goes real fast. All you see is it's like a movie screen, right? You don't see the individual frames going on. It looks like a continuous story, right? And that's what's going on in your brain. It's blink, 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 really fast, and this gives you this little stream of conscious feeling. So they have this theory that it's these little microtubules that are causing this little quantum collapse, which is triggering boom, 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 these little blinking moments of consciousness, and then somehow it gets integrated over your whole brain in some way. I'm not sure they have a good theory about that, but some of these little microtubules relate to a larger sense of consciousness. They get integrated together, or they get coordinated, or I guess that's the orchestrated part, right? The orc of the OR. The ORC is the orchestrated objective reduction model. That's what OR stands for. So somehow these little blinking things, they get synchronized, right? So all these microtubules, instead of blinking randomly off and on, they blink together, blink, 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 and they're going this very fast. And somehow, because they all work together synchronously, that gives me sort of this one continuous feeling of consciousness. Because otherwise, there would be 100 billion little consciousness going on, blink, 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 at all different rates and times, right? So I think that's basically sort of the simplified version of this model. So it's kind of interesting model of human consciousness on the one hand, but it also implies that anywhere in nature that these little structures exist that might have quantum collapse, those are also little blinking moments of consciousness. And those could happen, lots of places, maybe everywhere in some sense. And I don't know that they've really studied that one a lot, but the implication is that those could be almost ubiquitous, almost anywhere there's little crystalline structures or molecular structures that form a little cavity, and that little cavity could be a little microtubule, and there's a little quantum collapse going on in there, and it's giving little blinking thoughts of consciousness. So it has an implications of panpsychist thinking in it. It's scientifically based, which is kind of nice, because they know we have these little microtubule things. We know they're the right size for a quantum collapse. So it is a kind of a scientific theory. Penrose is a physicist. Stewart is a scientist, or a medical doctor. I guess he's an anesthesiologist. Mm-hmm. So it is sort of unique in that sense. Those guys are really well grounded in the materialist science that we were just criticizing. So you can sort of actually be a materialist scientist and also have a theory that's panpsychist. And that's what they are presenting. They've been doing this for well over 20 years now. I've been talking to Stuart off and on over a couple of decades about these ideas. So yep.
So I think it's so cool. This, like, trying to rethink this relationship between mind and matter. Sorry, I have 3 dogs and maybe a delivery coming. So
That's fine.
So just in summary, panpsychism just really suggests that consciousness existed before anything ever, and
From the beginning of time, from the
yeah,
Big Bang, or from forever, basically. It was a fundamental quality of nature. Just like the physicists, they have their fundamental qualities too, like mass and spin and electric charge. I mean, there's certain things they'll run through a list. What are the fundamental qualities? Well, those always have been here. Mass didn't just come into being one day 2 billion years ago. Electric charge didn't just come into being. It was always here.
right.
And all we're doing is we're adding one more thing to the list, and we're saying that one more thing is consciousness. And that was also always here from the very beginning, the Big Bang, or before the Big Bang, or however far back you want to go. That was just a fundamental quality of reality. And physics talks about the handful of other things, and we talk about the conscious piece, and those are sort of working in parallel. So yeah, that's kind of the view.
Yeah, I thought it was, fascinating in the dialogue where you're talking about Plato elaborates on the tripartite theory of the soul.
Yeah.
And discussing the elements of like the 3 layers. And ultimately he said that earth and stars only have the highest soul, which is reason. And the other ones were reason, spirit, and appetite or desire. So, as a gardener, and my husband does bonsai trees. So I was talking to him, I talk about it. I call it tree torture. Cause I'm like, you're like torturing these trees and putting braces on them, and they're alive and they have desires, babe. And, we were just kind of debating on this concept because I think it just goes into the vegan versus animal debate. When we talk about this layer of consciousness, I think or the abortion debate, like it goes into all these really important topics of like, right. So I really appreciate your time. I'm just kind of scratching the surface on that. I highly recommend, I'm only in like the chapter 6 of your book, going over all of these topics and concepts. It's a dense read. I feel like it's for like high level philosophy students.
I tried to make it as accessible as I could. So I'm trying not to assume too much. Some philosophy books, well, we assume you already know all this stuff and, you have this whole background. So I'm trying not to assume too much. So I try to make it as readable as I can. Obviously, I want people to read it and understand it. So, but yeah, definitely be great. I'd love to talk about it again or have people read it, and that would be a great. It's really sort of an important thing. It's not just some abstract theory of mind. It has a lot of implications.
It really does.
Environmentalism, for nature, for human societies. I mean, it really has a lot of implications.
I think it's something we could really ground ourselves in when we're trying to, like, I just put out a piece about how this like myth that Christianity is how we're going to save the West right now. I think it's like a really dangerous and poorly thought out idea. And so again, I think bringing back some of these more ancient concepts to honor the cycles of the earth and work with the rhythms of the equinoxes, I think it's really cool. So moving on, if you're ready to.
Sure, of course.
So listeners, Skrbina and I were talking, and he had not heard of Fitzgerald's review, and this is on Carrier's blog. I wasn't sure he had heard of it when we brought him on for the first episode. If you guys remember that, we talked about some of the chapter 7 and 8 of his 2nd edition book, specifically address criticisms. And I was like, I don't think he touched on any of this stuff. So here we are looking at the Carrier blog shared on the screen. And, before we get into the specifics, I'd like for you just to break down, like, what was the central misrepresentation between, like, with both Fitzgerald and Carrier in regards to your book, The Jesus Hoax?
Yeah, so it's a weird situation. It looks like it was an old review that they tried to update because they couldn't get it published anywhere else, or I don't know what, and then they just decided to post it on Carrier's website. So yeah, the review is of the 1st edition of my book, which came out was released in the calendar year 2016. So somehow they got a hold of that. Apparently Fitzgerald did. He must have been the first one who got a hold of it, or he bought the ebook version. I don't know what he did, but he got that. He didn't like it. He started to critique it, obviously, and he wrote this thing up. And then they resurrected it here recently. This was just posted about a month ago.
Yep, the 9th on February.
Exactly a month ago.
Yeah.
Online with some updates and input from Richard Carrier. So Carrier is a more professionally degreed thinker, and And so he's got, more sort of formal training in this area, and he's a little bit more technically astute, I believe, than Fitzgerald, who's not really a PhD specialist in this area. But anyway, so yeah, doesn't matter. Neither of them like my book, so they're really sort of attacking the book on multiple levels. Of course, when you attack the first edition and there's significant changes in the second edition, then you end up looking a little stupid because you missed a bunch of things that I fixed and I supplemented in the second edition. So that was sort of one big problem. But they just do a lot of attacks on me. It's sort of, I guess the point is really, it's an ad hominem attacking review. I called it a hatchet job. I mean, everybody sort of knows what a hatchet job is, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of the intent was to slander the author, just attack the book, just make it look bad, make it whatever. Try to get people to not take it seriously. Don't buy this book. It's terrible. Blah blah blah. So that's really, it's not an honest review, in that it's looking at both sides, and it's talking about the good points because everybody has some good points, and then talking about the weak points. Everybody has weak points. So I mean, that would be great. I would have loved to have that kind of review. Give me an honest review. I mean, obviously there's things that I didn't include there because it's a relatively short book. It's intended for popular readership. So I'm not going into micro details, and I'm not sourcing, 26 sources for each point that I'm making, and there's not a billion footnotes and so forth. It's trying to get to the essential points of my argument that I was trying to make, which was basically that there's no biblical Jesus, but there is a historical Jesus. So that was kind of my context. And when you look at that view, you implicate the Jews who were active at the time. So basically Paul, who was an ethnic Jew, and the gospel writers who I believe were Jews, or at least mostly Jews. So then they become sucked into the story about what they constructed and why they did it and so forth. So that was kind of the thesis behind my book, and I think it's pretty well documented. I didn't invent this idea. It's been around since the 1700s. Nietzsche wrote a lot about this in various places, and I quote him at points. So it's an idea that's been 200 years old. It was never really well articulated, and it was never really supplemented with latest archaeological data and some factual stuff that we know now today that Nietzsche didn't know in the 1880s or 1890s. So I've updated it, I've compiled it, pulled it together, supplemented with data that we now have, and I think I try to make it a strong, coherent argument. And that's sort of the point of the Jesus hoax. And so they blasted me in this silly review, which is mostly an ad hominem attack. It was nitpicky on lots of little technical points that didn't really matter one way or the other. And they're just attacking me and calling me names and all this nice stuff. So I actually tacked a note on the bottom of the blog. It probably is still there. If you look at the bottom of that review, there's a comment, by the way, the chat section at the end of the blog on Carrier's site.
Oh, on Carrier's site?
On Carrier's site, yeah. I think it's still there. If you have it, you can check it. So here's me. So I jumped on. I said, "Hey, Richard Carrier, do I get equal time to respond to the Fitzgerald review and these malicious comments?" Because the comments were horrible, since they were worse than the review. Or is it the full-time one-sided slander here at your blog? So that was my little slightly snarky comment to Carrier. And his response, you can see his response right there. He doesn't do both sides-ism, which says, I don't give equal time to people. I don't have to give equal time. It's my blog, and I can do what I want. Okay, but at least, okay. But he was at least generous enough, so he says he'll let me post a link to something that I publish. So a few days later, I wrote my reply. We'll go back to that in a minute. My reply is posted at the homepage of my book of thejesushoax.com, and you can scroll down to read it. Mm-hmm. And of course, I welcome any replies. And I don't think there was anything. There was some person that asked some stupid comments. I don't think I got any intelligent replies from either Carrier or Fitzgerald. I would welcome them at any point in time. I don't hold my breath because I don't think they'll respond, but I'm open to that. I'm open to having an online debate. Let's do that, Richard Carrier, if you're out there listening, or Fitzgerald. Let's do a live online podcast debate. We'll just go through these things live, back and forth, and we'll hash it out. And I'm willing to do that, and I'm somehow guessing that they're not willing to do that. So yeah, I guess we have to draw our conclusions from that. So
I thought what struck me when I was reading the response obviously was the ad hominem attacks, the tone of the criticism. It definitely didn't come across. It was so weird, like the way Carrier, they just like circle jerk each other. They're like, Fitzgerald is exquisite and extraordinary. And I agree with everything in this critique. So I'm posting it on my blog. And it's like, this does not have this scholarly disagreement tone at all. It definitely sounded like a bunch of boys on the playground, snickering and gesturing, like you kind of said. Or it also felt kind of like gatekeeping, which was kind of what you were, are you getting paid $7,000 for this post, Carrier? Or,
Right.
Is there
Right.
some gatekeeping? Because, it made me think of the open letter to liberals that you wrote, gosh, I don't know, over a year ago at least, where you were talking about this like overall losing trust in institutional authority and just the overall intellectual culture. And I just felt like that was the exact same dynamic playing out right here in these mythicist debates, the way that they were like, can you believe that he wrote a letter to the Unabomber? Can you believe that he wrote about this? I was like, what does this even matter? They were really trying to break you down before they even kicked off the critique of your work. It was
Yeah.
destabilizing, honestly, from
it's like a case study. I mean, they should publish that in textbooks, because it's like a case study of attacking somebody and their background, and we're going to say nasty thing. We're going to dredge up every nasty thing we can find on the internet about you, and therefore you must be wrong. Because yeah, I mean, it's like classic, just stupid ad hominem attacks, right? So yeah,
he's the Holocaust denier. That's like the biggest one. Like, I can't believe you even talked to him. And it's like, to me, it's like, if at this point we just like go, really? Okay, moving forward. Like at this point, the Overton window has extended past that to being, I think, a red flag, but maybe not. And definitely not for, like you were saying about these Jewish interests. Like, are they paid? Are they sponsored? It also seemed like the major point of tension was motive. They were like really struggling that you were kind of trying to pinpoint specific motives. And on Adam Green's podcast just the other day, Adam played some clips from Carrier's own audiobooks saying very similar kind of argumentations. And I picked that up even in his latest book. He's kind of talking about that's where this conversation needs to go. And that's where you went. And like you said, y'all are on the same side. So why are they so against you?
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, one of the things is they are on the right page, I think. I mean, I agree with most of what they say.
Right.
And their logic is generally okay, and then they get sort of right down to a certain point, and then they like stop, right? And one of the stopping points is this question of motive, right? Because they have to say, well, look, Paul, either invented or significantly built up this story about Jesus. The gospel writers either invented or significantly elaborate on this biography of Jesus, who may or may not have been a biological person, but they played up, they made claims about miracles that they knew were wrong, or they couldn't possibly have known were correct. So what were these guys thinking? Why did they do this? And what end was they were trying to achieve, right? And they go sort of right down to that point, and they say, well, we don't know their motive, or well, we can't really guess, or I mean, they're just like, stop. They're just like afraid. I'm sort of like, well, let's just go the logic all the way to the end. The logical end is that, they had incentives. Jews were fighting against Romans. They had a long-standing dislike of non-Jews, including the pagans and the Arabs and, the non-Jews that lived in their area. And they had reason to work against them. They had reason to manipulate them through ideas, including theological ideas, religious ideas, and if they thought it would work to their benefit, they would do it. I mean, that's I guess maybe anybody in sort of a desperate situation would do a similar thing. I mean, in a sense, I'm giving them credit, like, hey, they did what maybe anyone would have done in that situation. You had an invading army and you're massively overwhelmed, you're outnumbered 100 to 1. Well, what are you going to do? Okay, I'm going to do what I can to attack at the belief system or the ideological underpinnings of the invaders. And I think that's really what they did. So, and yeah, I mean, to me, that's just all very logical. It makes sense. I can't prove it. I don't have a document that says Paul was thinking this, or, Matthew was thinking this, or John was thinking this. But I mean, it's the most logical, the most obvious solution that we can discern from what we do know. So if you don't like that, you have to come up with a better solution that's better than the obvious solution. Okay, maybe there is one. I don't think there is, but maybe there is. And or sort of, attack my arguments that I'm presenting, why this is a relatively obvious way to interpret events. And so they don't do either of those. They don't give a different set of motives. They don't undermine my arguments. They just call me names. So this says, well, okay, you got nothing to say. You have no better argument. You have no better view. You can't really criticize me. I can't really even respond because you didn't give me anything of substance to respond to. Maybe I missed some key quotes or something. I don't know. I mean, but bring them out, but they just don't do it. They just like to throw names at me. And okay, so all right, so you guys have nothing to say. That's my conclusion.
Yeah, and so for me being so like first a layman, not a scholar, just have like a 4-year degree, it was hard. It's hard for me to like I said, I did stand up for you when I was talking to Fitzgerald and push back and was like, I don't know, it was very uncomfortable for me for how he not only does the review come across that, he speaks like that in person. He shied me away from you in your work. And so that sort of gatekeeping is like a big red flag for me in general in regards to how I want to present any idea. Like you said in the open letter to liberals, like if we're in a free society, then why would you act like that or speak like that? We should be able to critique any ideology. Anything should be open to debate. So before like we move into, I have one other question I want to ask you. Can you just specifically talk about like what I've highlighted here in your review about, because this was something that when I read over the review and when Fitzgerald mentioned it to me that you were cherry picking these sources, that you left out these potential positive statements about the Jews and the Gentiles in the ancient world. I don't know enough about these sources and primary sources like you do to like kind of be a fire pushback. And so I do appreciate this little area. I'd love for you just to kind of elaborate a little bit on the section because it was kind of one of my favorites, and then and then move on.
So yeah, so in the Jesus Hoax book, in my book, there's a chapter 4, which is trying to go back past times, prior to the time of Jesus, prior to the Roman invasion, which was about 63 BC. Go back, a few hundred years, back to the Old Testament days, and try to figure out what's going on between Jews and Gentiles, right? There's kind of an interesting story that's there. It's documented in the Old Testament, which is basically a Jewish manual for how to interact in a world of non-Jews who you don't like and you're struggling to overcome, right? And so it's written, the Old Testament is written like somebody who has a massive inferiority complex. So you're going to say, look, God loves me. God picked me out of every, being on every planet in the universe. God picked my people, and, he chose me, and he gave me the earth, and I get to dominate, and I get to rule, and God said so. So everybody else has to just shut up and take it. And so there's this very dominating, misanthropic character throughout the Old Testament. It's pretty well documented. It's not really even disputed at this point. So I did a little bit of that in the book of this chapter 4. So I'm saying the Jews had this very belligerent, arrogant, domineering attitude towards everybody who wasn't a Jew. I mean, everybody else. It was basically a misanthropic view, right? It was kind of it's like a hatred of humanity. We don't like you. God didn't choose you. He chose us. We can rule over you. We can use you to achieve our ends. All right. So that was sort of the first half of chapter 4. The second half says, when somebody does that to non-Jews for a long time, the non-Jews tend to react. And when they look at people who are like that and they say, those guys are bastards, those guys, they hate people. They're superstitious. They're like super arrogant. They're like horrible. And indeed, that's what's happened. Sorry, hold on a second. Sorry. Indeed, we find that's what happened when we go back to the documented evidence from writings from, say, 300 BC onward. From 300 BC onward, we see that the Gentiles, the non-Jews, are reacting negatively. So whenever they encounter Jews or they write about Jews, it's negative stuff. These guys hate everybody. They're heathens. They're cursed. They're seditious. They're malicious. They're liars. They're deceivers. I mean, and that's what they were seeing. They weren't just making this up. This was what they were saying. This is what you would expect from a people who were arrogant and thought they were chosen by God. So in the second half of the chapter 4, I'm documenting from history, from famous ancient authors, from 300 BC, 200 BC, 100 BC, right up until Christian times, these sort of malevolent attitudes, to show that there was sort of this antipathy. It was on both sides. I think it was grounded in the Jewish views. The other writers, they didn't hate everybody. They said, look, these people are uniquely malevolent. From everybody that we know, they didn't know the whole world, but from people we know, they're sort of uniquely bad, and we have some very unpleasant things to say about them. Okay, I mean, it is what it is. It's documented. I put all the sources, so anyone can check the sources if they're unclear. And so, yeah, in the review then, so Fitzgerald and Carrier, they're like attacking my chapter 4. They didn't even talk about the first half, which is the Jewish misanthropic thinking, and the stuff that maybe caused this. They don't talk about that. They go right to the reaction, and they say, well, he's just picking out the bad stuff, and he found some bad quotes in history, and that's the cherry picking. Oh, he just picked the bad quotes, and well, there's obviously lots of good quotes because everybody loves Jews, and so I just left those out because it didn't fit my story. And my answer was, actually, that's not the case. I mean, you go through the ancient sources, you go through the books like Stern and look at other sources, and you kind of say, well, look, there just doesn't seem to be any. I mean, there's some neutral statements, just factual statements. Well, Jews were living in Judea at the time. Okay, that's not really one way or the other. But when they're making evaluative comments, normative comments about the Jews, they're pretty much universally negative. And there's other scholars have known that. I mean, I've got some quotes. I've seen some quotes where other scholars have admitted, oh boy, everybody in the ancient world didn't like the Jews. I mean, that's just how it was. So there's this one book. I said there's this one Jewish scholar, Feldman, who tried to construct the story. He said, well, there must have been somebody who said something good about the Jews, because he's a Jewish scholar, and he wrote this book, Jew and Gentile in the Ancient World, from 1993, 30-year-old book, and he tries to document the story of, well, there was really good things that were said about the ancient Jews, and the book is just like I said. So the book fails miserably. I mean, it's kind of interesting to try to look for, you're like, wait a minute, where are those actually, all those good things that supposedly, and you don't really find any. He's talking around this, he's giving some background, he's explaining, he's making excuses, blah, blah, blah. He cites some things where Josephus, who's an ancient writer, said some good things about the Jews, but he was a Jew. I mean, so yeah, of course you're going to find Jews who said good things about Jews, but that wasn't the point. The point was, what did the Gentiles, the non-Jews, say about? And he twists things, he'll, like I said, making lemons out of lemonade. It's funny. He'll just take the Jews were, belligerent and they never let up. And he'll just say, well, they were very tenacious, and tenacious is a good thing. So even though it sounded bad, he really said the Jews are tenacious, and that's a good thing. I mean, you can sort of, really twist the wording and try to make something nice out of it. But anybody reading anything like that's going to say, yeah, that's not a nice thing to say.
Right.
So basically the point holds, and they utterly failed to refute it. I gave them more of a story than they gave me. At least I brought the Feldman book, but they didn't even know about it. So
of course, I
mean,
like
you said, but if you got better story, let us know there, Carrier or Fitzgerald, but they don't even respond because they can't find any, because they don't exist. I know, I've been looking at this stuff for years. So
I thought that was. I appreciated that in your review. You're just like, the reader can go ahead and make your own determination, and good luck with that. I've read their entire work. You were just a little bit playfully snarky, but I think from your standpoint is that you've read a lot of these primary sources, and you can kind of tell that maybe F&C haven't, and that's just unfortunate. If you're going to throw your ring in the hat, even me, when I bring on these authors, I am kind of throwing my ring in the hat a little bit, but to the point where you put out a critique on a book this harsh, I feel like you think you would cross your T's and dot your I's a little bit more.
Yeah, you still want to really have a solid criticism if you're going to go that harsh, but yeah, they just didn't have it. So
it's not a good look. It's not a good look. And
Yeah.
Considering both of them are like leftists, it's like not shocking, but it's still discouraging and sad. So before I move on to like Adam Green and the midrashic kind of concepts, I was curious, are you familiar with Nina Levaces? I don't know how to say her last name, but her work about that the Pauline corpus may be a complete literary construction. Have you seen any of her work?
I don't know the name.
Uh, and
I
I
don't know
didn't
if it was
pronounce
a
it.
certain book that she published or articles that she published. I
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah, I'll pull it up for you.
I generally know the idea that some people have said that Paul was maybe not a real person, or he was an invented person, or he was he represented a collection of people.
Yeah, here's her book. It's over $100, so I've yet to purchase it. But it's based on that she thinks the letters were maybe from the school of Marcion. I
Yeah.
had a couple interviews with her. But you've already mentioned this. Both you and Adam talked about like, if Paul ended up not being real, it doesn't negate either one of your theses.
Right.
Right?
Right. I mean, there's a sort of an argument because we don't have any confirming historical confirmation that Paul's letters actually existed when we think they were written. Right.
Right.
So we think that Paul's letters were the earliest surviving texts in Christian, historiographical, the Apocrypha, right? The ancient documents that we sort of use to build up the New Testament. These are actually part of the New Testament. So they date from typically traditionally 50 to 70 A.D., which were all written before the Gospels were written.
Mm-hmm.
And if that was true, then there should be somebody else at that time or nearly there after this commenting that said, "Oh, I read Paul's letter to the Romans and I liked it or I didn't like it or something." But there's nothing. So we have nothing at that time or even close to that time that says anybody found a letter, read a letter, got a letter, nothing, right? So, and it's funny because even the Gospels, which were written later, don't.
Mm-hmm.
The Gospels don't refer to the letters, really. I mean,
Right.
there's some vague allusions, but it's not like, hey, we read Paul's letter to the Romans and we Paul's letter to the Corinthians. It's just not there. So there is a kind of reason to think that maybe they were written like way later, like Marcion was 150 AD or something like this, well into the 2nd century. So yeah, it's possible. I left that possibility open. I don't think it's likely, but I think it's certainly possible. But even if that's the case, that just modifies at least my view, and I think even Adam Green's view. Even if Paul didn't really exist and somebody forged these letters, 100 years after they thought they were written, you still have the Gospels. And we still think the Gospels were written from between like the year 70 and the year 95, right? Mark was the first, then Matthew and Luke, and then John was the last one. So we think the Gospels were written somewhere in that period. And if there was no Paul letters or there was no Paul at all, then these guys, they had to be the originators of the hoax, the story, the myth of Jesus. And it looks like they invented just out of whole cloth, right? Mark starts with a guy, a full-grown adult Jesus who gets baptized and then starts his ministry. And then the later Gospels, then they bring in the birth story in Bethlehem and the Star of Bethlehem and the 3 wise men and all this kind of stuff. So they're trying to make it into a real person. That comes later. So if that's the case, bottom line, if that's the case, then the hoax sort of shifts from an emphasis on Paul, which is what I assumed in my book. But if we say he doesn't exist or push him to later, then the emphasis focuses on the gospel writers. Somebody invented it. Somewhere it came into being. Sometime it wasn't, and somebody wrote it down like it was true, and it wasn't true. So now we can shift it. Now it's not. I'd have to change the subtitle to my book right now. It's not Paul and his cabal. Now it's the gospel writers and their cabal who constructed the Jesus hoax. And okay, I can change my subtitle. That's okay.
Yeah.
But basically, the story doesn't change. It shifts a little bit in time. The basic argument is there. The basic story is unchanged. So I'm kind of trying to follow these arguments about Paul. Did I say a little bit too? And I don't know that particular book. Like I say, I'm intrigued by the arguments, and I'm willing to change my position if it looks like that's a compelling case. from what I know, I don't really think it's a likelihood, but yeah, I'm always open to that idea.
Yeah, we have to have some sort of intellectual humility when we're, reaching these sort of topics when it comes to the history. It's like a soft science. So we're both reading The Jesus Deception. I'm almost done. And, I watched, like I said earlier, the interview with Adam Green, of course. And so overall, you sounded on that interview that you had a very positive review about it. You were impressed with the kind of academic approach. Like, goodness, like each chapter, it's like, I really did appreciate, like, the prophets chapter is really long, the epithets chapter. And then he even talks about just this evolution, this midrastic concept of the Star of Bethlehem and kind of where some of these stories came from. And in that conversation, you were really trying to hone in on what we were just talking about, like whatever cabal it was, they invented the story. All three of us kind of believe that it was to theologically conquer Rome. And you were purporting, for those of us who might believe, I might lean more towards the celestial figure myself and be in that camp. And you were purporting, like, that seems like such a harder concept to convince the Gentiles of than just a simple earthly preacher that was crucified by Romans, which is kind of your take in the Jesus hoax. And I was really fascinated by kind of that overall kind of big picture that you were trying to paint for us. And I was thinking about some of the other myths that might have been kind of circling in that area in the Bronze Age. There were already kind of dying and resurrection myths. I was wondering if maybe, we're talking about if whoever Paul was writing to, Paul was already writing to people, right? So there was already groups existing, perhaps, or maybe he just made them up in his head. Do you know what I'm trying to say? So like maybe they were already worshiping these kind of celestial heavenly concepts and some of these other pagan deities. And so it wasn't such a foreign step to take the Gentiles, perhaps. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, could be. I mean, it's good just to clarify for your viewers, right? So there's this thing called Jesus mythicism, which basically says there is no biblical Jesus. So there was no miracle working Son of God, raised people from the dead, resurrected heaven. So that's the mythicists pretty much all agree that that's true, right? So, but there's two versions after that. You can accept that, and you could say, and there was no historical guy, no flesh and blood guy who lived and died. Or there was. So there's these two versions of Jesus mythicism, right? And I'm sort of on the side, I can go either way. It doesn't really harm my theory either way, but I tend to think, there's a good reason to think, that there was an actual guy, flesh and blood guy, rabbi, a Jewish guy, Jesus of Nazareth, and he probably taught in Jerusalem, and he was probably a great speaker and got people all worked up, and he was agitating to get against the Romans because they were the oppressors, and he probably got the attention of the Romans. They probably crucified him, and he died, and they buried him, and that was it. That's probably what happened. And then later they turned that guy into a son of God and working miracles. To me, that makes more sense. But you could say, no, there was no flesh and blood guy. There was no rabbi Jesus. It's just all drawn from the Old Testament, all these weird sort of spiritual, esoteric, weird phrases like the Son of Man and the branch and the root and all these kind of nice little terms, right? It was kind of all there. And then you can somehow construct they call it a celestial Jesus or a heavenly Jesus, that Jesus only existed in heaven. And, he preached, I don't know how it works. I mean, it's a little bit funny. Like, he preached in heaven, he fought the evil spirits in heaven, and they defeated him. And then he got crucified in heaven. I didn't know they could do that in heaven, but maybe they can.
Yeah.
And then he got resurrected back up to heaven after he got crucified. Okay, it's a little bit sort of a goofy sort of story, but I guess maybe it was just, it's all metaphorical crucifixion. I don't know. Okay. But sort of this is the celestial Jesus version of mythicism, and Carrier supports that view. He's written a couple of books about celestial Jesus, but he doesn't explain how that's really worked. Adam does a really good job of talking sort of about maybe it was a celestial Jesus, or was at least certainly drawn from all these Old Testament sources, and he really documents it well. But there's still something a little bit left hanging even in Adam's book, and this is where I kind of pressed him. I said, well, look, you should have added one more chapter in your book with it, really to sort of explain to us how that actually turned into the stories that we see documented today.
Yeah. And I
So
think that's
yeah.
good. I mean, I think he looks to you for that. Like he's going to be going to debates and stuff. So I do think I mean, I know, I can tell from how he speaks of you in other streams. He was very excited. I would be so stoked. Be like, Skrbina read my book and he thinks I'm smart. Like I would be really stoked. I think that's super cool. For both of you, just to from past interviews, I saw how Adam was trying to explain some of these ideas to you. So I think he was very excited to finally get them on paper so other folks in this sort of field can process and kind of see what he's trying to bring to the table, which I do think is quite fascinating and compelling. Like you said, like you're compelled by it. And so, you know, to kind of close down the conversation, because we're coming up on that time, I thought this would be a good way to kind of fuse both of your books, because Adam brings up that concept of hyperstition and basically this apocalyptic worldview from Second Temple Judaism, kind of basically is evangelicalism here in America, and where we are. Basically, your whole Jesus hoax was that we theologically conquered Rome with ideas. And I still think that we are theologically conquered right now with similar ideas, to the point where we meaning our government can make moves in alignment with whatever the text says. And so it's kind of the similar concept of like this hyperstition. So I thought that would be interesting if you could kind of unpack some of that concept with us, because it's a cultural script, but it is a philosophical idea, right? The concept of hyperstition.
Yeah, I don't recall the formal definition of what that was. Somebody invented that one. Who who was the guy that came up?
Well, the idea is that beliefs can begin to shape reality simply because people act on them. You know, so it becomes so strong in this like way of thinking.
So yeah, it's not merely superstition, but it's a superstition put into action that's actually shaping the way you view things. I guess something like taken seriously, or that it affects your real life in some sense.
I mean, the placebo effect, we know is real. So we know if you know, your thoughts can impact stuff. So it's not this like manifestation concept where if you think it's strong enough, it becomes true. But I think that when so many folks believe that the New Testament is historically true, they believe that these prophecies are real. They believe that Jesus fulfilled these prophecies. And so that's what we're looking at. I think that's how Rome was conquered, by people actually believing that these stories were to be true. Correct?
Yeah, right. Right. So they were either sort of contaminated with these beliefs, or they drifted away from Roman beliefs, which were very different sort of beliefs, a different value system. And they decided that the Romans were, you know, sort of evil pagans, or influenced by the devil or Satan, because the Romans weren't believing all these nice stories about Jesus and, you know, eternal life and so forth. So it actually made them belligerent towards the Roman belief system and the Roman pantheon of gods. And they thought that was all just evil paganism. And then so they sought to, you know, crush that, sort of literally in some ways and figuratively in others, to just destroy those old ancient Roman beliefs. And of course, lots of things go along with it. You can, you know, I guess you could argue that we don't need to believe in Jupiter and Hera and Apollo anymore, but lots of other things went down with that whole worldview. So it was really attack on the Roman, which was actually the Greek Roman worldview, which was really the foundation of Western civilization. That was really attacked on multiple levels by this Christian, Judeo-Christian theological story, which I think was made up nonsense, basically to do that, precisely to undermine the Roman and the European worldview. That was what it was intended to do, and so it's very destructive of higher civilization in that sense. That was, in a sense, that was its goal, and in a way it achieved that. It sort of helped to bring down Rome. It was certainly one of the causal factors that ended the Roman Empire, and it's continuing to been a drain on humanity for 2,000 years. So yeah, that's how it is.
Yeah. So have you heard of Charles Freeman's work? He wrote the book, The Closing and the Closing of the Western Mind, The Rise of Faith and the Fall of Reason. And then he wrote a second book, The Reopening of the Western Mind. Have you read or heard of either?
No, yeah. I'm vaguely familiar, but no, I haven't read those books. Okay. So.
Well, I am a theology nerd, and this one's really dense and the text is small when it comes to it. But why I'm bringing it up, and I wanted to leave it a comment on Adam's thing, because it kind of does trace the theological story of how we got from what you were just stating, like the Greco-Roman worldview, to how we got to where we are. And just specifically speak a lot about Constantine, but this book was really interesting when it comes to tracing the theological ideas as they evolved. So I just wanted to throw that out there for you or the listeners. And so did you take a look at this article I sent over the weekend?
Yeah, I did, exactly. So this is sort of the latest, most pernicious manifestation of Judeo-Christian thinking, right? It seems to have taken over some of these leading figures in the government, and it's even altering, the U.S. military policy and arguably directing the attack on Iran, and it's allowing the Jews in Israel to attack the Palestinians and cause all kinds of chaos and death in the Middle East generally. Because it's sort of this blind adherence to this idea that Jews are chosen and that they're doing God's work. And it doesn't make sense on multiple levels, right? So because the Jews don't believe in Jesus, they think he's a fraud or doesn't exist. But of course, now we believe that the Jews are chosen, and we believe in Jesus. We believe in two things that don't fit together. So, and we believe that Jesus somehow wants us to support the Jews or support Israel. We don't know why, because he didn't really say about that. We think Jesus is coming back sometime, and I think that was right. This is sort of a prelude to return of Jesus, and he doesn't really say he's coming back. I mean, there's some vague sort of comments about the return of the Son or something. I mean, you really got to be stretching the words to kind of figure that out, but they stretched every concept as thin as they could, and they said, well, when the Jews returned to Israel, all Jews return to Israel, and they rebuild the temple, and we destroy all the enemies of the Jews, and then Jesus will be happy to come back, because now that's his time to show up. And they make all these really bizarre and insane kind of statements, like they know that they're true. It's just sheer nonsense. It's not documented in either the Old or the New Testament. It's some implication of a referral of an insinuation that somebody says at some point in time. But they make these bizarre and insane kind of statements, and then they start acting on them, and they're blowing people up, and people are dying, and they're slaughtering people by the thousands. And that's just a classic example of how wrong you can go when you have a wrong theology, a theology that's based on nonsense and lies and mythology and fraud, and you act on that, then you can go horribly wrong, and that's exactly what's going on here.
Yes. For those who might be listening that don't hang out with military folks who are so upset and confused, like I am very much, I understand where they're coming from, but so many people think the government, the military should just overturn the government or just ignore these orders. And I wish it was that simple. Have you heard of
right. I mean, they're trained to sort of be mindlessly obedient. I mean, that's really, I think that's beaten into them from day one. That's the old boot camp thing. You don't think you're just a tool. You listen to me, you follow orders. You don't think you're a robot. I mean, I think that just pounded into them from day one.
Yeah.
And you don't question, you don't ask questions, you don't try to analyze, you don't try to think on your own. So that's basically the military mindset. I mean, in a sense, there's kind of an argument for that, because you can't really be effective until the generals are correcting things and the people have to follow. So sort of practical reasons, but it's so dehumanizing and so humiliating and so undignifying that it just shows the whole military concept of a mass standing military is just highly destructive of society. I mean, even in ancient times, you never had a standing army, right? The army was when you found a threat from somebody who was invading, all the males,
right?
The fighting age males from the late teens to the men who weren't too old. They got together and they got their weapons, they got their horses, they got their swords, and they went out and they fought. That was your. And then when you win or lose, if you survive, you go back home, and you go back to work, and you go back to your farms and everything else. You didn't have a standing army. Right. And that, that act, that was sort of I'm sure there's some nice histories of militarism in the West, but the move from a part-time army of actual citizens who had real lives to a full-time army that's only, purely indoctrinated to be sort of, bloodthirsty, sort of ruthless killers and mindless rule followers. I mean, that was kind of an interesting transition of that over time, and it's just it's just terribly destructive thing to have.
Not to mention, just like the pay. It's like the pay is so good. It's so tempting. And that's all I want to say.
Right.
That's why
Yeah.
so many men are there, because to be a provider, to be able to
Right.
stay alive in this society is
Well,
tough. And
yeah.
so
Well,
again,
we have the military spends over $1 trillion a year, right? That's $1,000 billion a year.
mind numbing.
And it's so much money. I mean, they just can throw money in anything. They can throw money at contractors, at weapon manufacturers, at recruits. They don't have enough recruits. We'll double your pay. Oh, that's not enough. We'll triple your pay. We have billions of dollars, and we can pay you 100,000 or 200,000. I don't know what these guys are getting paid. We can give you benefits for life and all kinds of, because we need robots to fill our troops and to do sort of the boots on the ground kind of bloody work. At least for now. Maybe someday they'll have robots, actual robots. I don't know, but for now we can just keep throwing money at you, and eventually you pay somebody who's poor and comes from a poor background. You can throw enough money at him. Yeah, I'll pay $500,000. Yeah, sign me up. I mean,
the medical benefits are huge. Like my husband had someone in his family that was sick, and so he was like, "Oh my gosh!" Like just the pull to be able to provide for his sick family member. So yeah, this is important, like the gray area when it comes to morality. I mean, in our first interview, you talked about the concept of evil, and you weren't really a big fan of that. And so I do think it's very interesting when we just try to, and on this podcast, Taste of Truth Tuesdays, we always try to find the gray zone, which can kind of be kind of annoying. But I think it's important to try to find compassion and understanding for people, because that's how we just don't have our hearts turn black into hatred. So as we're closing down, are you familiar with Representative Thomas Massie? I'm sure you probably.
Yeah, sure. He's the only guy with integrity in all of Congress.
I know. So. And he's a farmer, and he's an inventor, and he's so cool. So I just wanted to play a quick little clip, not even the whole thing, about where he specifically talks about how Israel is why we're here. And so he put together this war power resolutions bill. He's working specifically with a progressive representative from California. And what is so crazy is I go undercover with another streamer and far left trainings, and we actually agreed with almost everything this progressive, not like Democrat, socialist, or revolutionary communist, not that far left, but they were progressives, and we agreed with so much of what they were saying in regards to this anti-war kind of rhetoric that was developing. Not that I'll end up voting Democrat by any means, but I am willing to partner with progressives, which is a lot. To say that is a lot, to pass something like this war power resolution bill, which is what Thomas Massie is presenting, and working with someone from California. I haven't seen the voting record of it though, but he's basically just trying to bring back the power of the Constitution, because this is obviously, illegal what we're doing with Iran. So let me just play this quick clip for us. Can we hear it?
Meanwhile, the Department of Defense conceded there was no evidence of an imminent Iranian strike. Some told us this war was about nuclear weapons, but 6 months ago, we were assured our last strike on Iran decimated their nuclear program. So which is it? I think the most candid answer came from the Secretary of State, who told the press that Israel forced our hand and dragged us into this war. Again. And that truth is the very reason why.
It's just that one clip right there where he's talking about the Secretary of State was the most honest here, is that Israel's dragging us into this war. We're like $8 trillion in debt. It is nauseating. I feel like we are in a really bad dystopian movie that doesn't even have like flying saucers or any of the cool shit that the Jetsons like presented to us, just all the dystopian shit. And so, in closing, that's basically, I just wanted to share that, because, the Overton is there.
That was what Rubio basically misspoke, and some truth slipped out, I think accidentally, and he said, well, Israel forced our hand because they were going to attack, so therefore we had to. So in a sense, that was admitting that they drive our policy. I mean, that's the least of it. That's the least of it. Let's talk about all the billions of the pro-Jewish lobby that's going to our politicians, and Trump's connection to billionaire Jews. Let's talk about that. That's completing the story. So so just the mere fact that they forced our hand in this particular event, that's one little piece of the truth. And even that caused an uproar. So yeah, it's interesting.
I'm just frustrated because the left is so obsessed with being anti-ICE and are so obsessed with that. I just do not understand. Like with Fitzgerald, he spoke of the cabal. He had an issue with that wording, and it came up on my podcast. And I said, how can you deny that? I guess this was pre-Epstein files, but now that they're being released, I'm just like, how are you so anti that word when it's freaking obvious that something's going on, bro? Like, knock, knock, wake up and smell the coffee for me, please. just being against that idea when we obviously see there's a bigger picture, there's some sort of kind of darker strings being pulled. And, Adam Green, I wish I found him earlier in my kind of discovery, because I didn't see how much Zionist pull Trump has had. I mean, his first awards he was getting from the Jews was like in the 78 and 83. So, I mean, he's been groomed for this position for decades. And it's just some of us in the Trump community, or like in the Maha community or the MAGA community, are kind of waking up to this and being like, we're betrayed. But actually, this was the plan all along. And that's, I think, something that Adam was awake to for a long time. And he's been hammering that message out. I think a lot of us are kind of late to the game when it comes to some of this, the psyop.
Yeah, well, better late than never, Megan.
Hey,
so
I'm here.
We'll take it whenever we can get it. So
yeah, they got me with RFKJ and Make America Healthy Again. Like, I've been in dietetics and a health coach my entire 20 plus years. So I care very much about this. And I followed RFKJ's work, and I was like, he sued Trump a couple times. Like, he's a good guy. And yep. So here we are. And I call that copium, or I think Adam even calls it copium. I was coping and hoping, and here we're realizing, whoops, I was, being sold a bad bag of drugs. So in closing, I just am so grateful for your time, and I know you're busy. Where do you think this debate goes? Like, we talked about a lot today, but I think it does all tie together when it comes to just the Jesus mythicism, his history, apocalyptic thinking. Like, what do you want to say in closing here? Like, where does this debate go? What are you working on? Anything exciting? Close it down however you want.
Yeah. Well, right. I mean, so the whole Jesus hoax, is kind of built into the Christian story, right? That is a kind of a fraud that was constructed for purposes, and basically it benefits Jews in Israel. That was the intention, and that seems to actually work. And even though they claim to not like Christians, they like the effects, which is it serves to their benefit. And I mean, I'm just kind of I'm struck by how many Christians there still are. They keep talking about Christianity is on a decline, and maybe it is. I mean, it's way declined in Europe. I work with some colleagues in Europe, and there's like very few people there who even pretend to believe Christians. They like having their nice churches and this nice architecture, but they don't believe that stuff. They don't go to church. Almost nobody goes to church in Europe, and in the U.S. it's like it's a lot of people by contrast. And it's declining.
It is declining in the Bible Belt. I was just reading some data on that. It is declining, but it doesn't seem like it when I'm in these, like, I'm constantly hit with this sort of stuff.
I know what you're saying. I mean, yeah, it's probably the pool is shrinking, but when you go from 40 million people to 39 million people, you don't really notice that fact, even though it's kind of shrinking. And the ones that are left are the more hardcore ones, right? The ones who are sort of more ideologically fanatical. So maybe they're becoming more prominent, they're making a louder voice, and they're having a bigger effect, because the ones who are sort of, on the fence, and they sort of think the light bulb goes on, they're like, I'm not going to stick with this anymore. Right. So you're left with sort of the most fanatical core of those people. But I mean, just the mythology is destructive, the effects are destructive, just the idea, the whole Christian idea that you have to have faith and you cannot use reason. I mean, there's like explicit statements in Paul, like, don't think about this, just believe it,
right.
And just sort of believe the authorities and believe. I mean, they didn't have a pope back then, but it was like, just if you're Catholic, believe the pope, or, just have faith and don't challenge these things. I mean, that's so damaging, especially when that's drawn into government, because people will just believe the government. They're like, you have to just believe the government, you just have to have faith, and you have to just follow them and don't ask questions, and they know more than you do. It's like, hey, but these guys are lunatics, and they're driven by money and forces sort of are, around them that you barely even see. And so that whole mindset of, we're going to just trust authorities. I'm not going to use my reason. I'm not going to think independently. That's a bad thing. I mean, that's just multiple levels of destruction there. And you got to say, well, look, that was sort of the point. That was sort of why it was invented. We want people just to believe these things, to not be thinking. Don't use your brains. Don't think for yourself. Just sort of be a nice little sheep and go along with the flow. And everything will be great. But things aren't great. Things are kind of going to hell. And so, yeah.
I mean even here, the phrase you used, going to hell, we can't even help it but to use these, like, these idioms that are rooted in the framework.
I know, it's like we use those things, like, sort of like, even though hell is sort of one of those made up things, we're still going there because these things are getting
feels like it.
better. Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah. But yeah, I mean, so I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of sad and pathetic, but I mean, I still sort of have my optimistic side. You know, I kind of feel like, in some sense, we're winning. I mean, sort of this sort of the massive believers seems to be on the decline. People are waking up to the Jewish question. People are understanding how Trump actually works. I think, I mean, just, you know, the massacre in Gaza was a huge eye opener for a lot of leftists. Now we got another Jewish war on Iran. That's getting, you know, waking up a whole other cohort of people. And you know, I mean, you got to be really dense not to see what's going on. I mean, it's so some of us have been talking about this for 20, 30 years. But to continue to refuse to believe that sort of Jews are driving this process in government. I mean, you really got to be just really sort of dense to not kind of see how that's going down. So, I mean, I'm trying to. I think I am. I'm basically optimistic that people are understanding these things enough. People are learning about them and becoming aware of them. That we're moving in the right direction. The momentum is on our side. The Jews and Israelis continue to do enough stupid and catastrophic things. You know, they shoot themselves in the feet all the time. I don't know how many feet they have, but they keep shooting themselves in the feet. You know, and they're just helping our cause. I mean, every time they do some stupid, you know, malicious, genocidal, murderous attack on a girls' school, you're like, or whatever. You're like, okay, we kind of said you've been doing that for 3,000 years. And, you know, Fitzgerald wants to say, well, no, nothing's wrong with those Jews. They're nice people. I'm like, well, okay. Yeah, people have been saying for 3,000 years, these guys are, you know, malicious, you know, ruthless sort of killers. And there they go. Oh,
doing the same thing.
Maybe they were right, you know, and it's just a slow process to wake people up from, you know, the 2,000-year nightmare, which is really what it was. And okay, I know we have to be patient. I hope it doesn't take 2,000 years to wake them all up, but I think we can do better than that. But at least a few of us are doing our best to kind of to get people thinking and open about these ideas. So.
You know, and I agree. And, you know, I have faith in, you know, the pagan-like folk, those of us who are, you know, out here, and I have faith in our ancestral gods, you know, whether they're real or not. I think there's an energy behind them. And I just, but I was also thinking about, how did they feel in 4th century Rome, or like when it was collapsing? Like, you know, I just feel like their positive thinking didn't stop that shit. And so I'm just trying to be like realistic, you know what I mean? It's not easy to do. And so I just, again, appreciate your insights, appreciate your work. And I just don't think being black-pilled is a pagan thing to do. It's just not what we do. We don't give up. We don't turn nihilistic. And I think that's just, whether it sounds stubborn or not, I think that's like really important to have that hopium, that sort of concept. So
I think it can give people confidence. And that's really what I try to do. If you know enough about what's going on, you have some facts, you'll understand things at a deeper level than you did before. You have confidence, and you can go out and say things. You can make assertions. You can back up what you say. You have confidence. You know what you're saying. It's not just, gee, I'm worried about this, doesn't seem right. I mean, actual reasons behind what you're doing. So I mean, I'm like an educator. That's sort of what I do.
You should see me on Substack. I'm one of your little soldiers out there. I'm like, and like have these long things saved in my notes too, just like my rebuttals.
I try not to overdo it, but I still feel like I'm kind of in this education mode. Like I think it's a good thing. I mean, people should want to know these things, and you feel better about yourself. You can ground your position in the world. You make a stronger person. You can make more assertive arguments. You're a more formidable power in the world because you have a confidence and you know what you're saying. So I think and I hope that we can give that to people on multiple levels. And you know, go out there and you know, try to do the right thing. Absolutely. So,
you know, I really appreciate that. I think that's true. You know, you've been teaching for all of your career, and whether that's in front of a students at a college or a university, or here on my YouTube channel, you know, you're doing that. And so I really appreciate that so much. I'll link all your books in the show notes for folks. Is there anything you're excited that you're working on right now? Any projects?
More is right. Kind of lately, it's been sort of more family sort of issues. Working, I mean, just doing various writing and editing things. I still try to shoot an occasional article out there on arms.com or something. Try to keep up to date on my personal website, davidskrbina.com, and if anybody's interested. And when I'm able to post new articles, I'll put a link there. So I think those are there. I've got a couple of book sites like the JesusHoax.com. I don't know if that one will be up at all times. I don't know. We'll see if it's worth keeping that up, but maybe it is. But yeah, certainly on the personal site, I try to keep people up on what's going on, what I've been writing and publishing. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I will link all those for my listeners so they can just have that easy access there, and just appreciate your time, your work, your dedication to this, because I think it is really important. Our work cut out for us with your simple work of the Jesus Hoax is so easy to read. It's so fun to read. It's probably the best mythicist book out there, because Adam's book is dense, right? There's a lot of scripture in there.
It's a lot of scripture, right? I mean, it's great for scholars. I mean, I love it because it's very, very sort of scholarly and helpful. But it's a little bit harder in terms of just the story of what's going on. But yeah. So.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really nice that y'all are contributing to these different things. And in my intro, I am going to talk about kind of the different camps and the mysticism, and kind of let folks kind of figure out where they want to find themselves and come into their own conclusions, as we like to support, right? Think for yourself.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, well, great. Well, thank you so much.